Alastair. I work for myself as such. Generally speaking, I work in perception and sensors, which is a fairly broad area. I consult in on some projects. This is one which was last year, this time last year actually. So it's a project which was funded by the UK Research and Innovation Council. It was based at the Postal Museum in London, and it also included Katie Gonzalez-Bell, who I would highly recommend if you need somebody to run accessibility user research stuff, and ScanLab Projects, who we will talk about later, but who are a three-dimensional scanning and three-dimensional modelling organisation who do quite startling things. So, I'll describe the project, I'll describe some of the stuff which came up in the technical side, and then I'll talk about some of the broader issues which came out of the project in accessibility terms. So the fundamentals of the project are moving from a real place to a virtual place, and specifically for accessibility reasons. So the real place is something called MailRail. Has anyone heard of MailRail here? One person. Yeah, okay, MailRail is a teeny tiny underground system in London. Ooh, that's really differently coloured. That's red over there.
It's a colour-blind simulation.
I was going to say, this is just like an exercise in colour perception. I'm going to have a blue dress on later. Okay. Miniature underground system developed by the Edwardians because above ground was too busy, so therefore they needed to be able to move the mail. 21 miles long, runs from Liverpool Street Station to Paddington. It was fully automated, so those are carriages which are fully automated, no driver, just mail bags. Multiple stops. Major stop is near Farringdon, which is where the Postal Museum is based, and where the MailRail experience is based. So, physically, this is the system. It's a small railway system running through its own set of tunnels, all of which still exist, and sometimes they do allow you to walk them. But original users, and this is very key on this thing, original users are mailbags. What about that too? About that one. And thus we get to the key issue that if the users originally were mailbags, the system was entirely brilliantly designed for them. However, if you're going to turn the MailRail into a visitor attraction, you're going to encounter the fact that it's going to be highly disabled, because it was designed not for the users that we're now talking about. Social model of disability. Disability is in design, not in people. The new users. MailRail turns into, so it was closed early 2000s. MailRail now turns into a visitor attraction, an attraction that you can actually go on, ride on. But that creates a number of issues in accessibility terms. Number one, teeny tiny carriages. Designed for mailbags, not human beings. Very small. There is no way anybody with mobility issues or a wheelchair user can access this system. It is just too small. This was all recognised in the design when they started of the attraction. Number two, and that is the view from inside one of the carriages. Do not go there if you are worried. Things closing in on you. And that actually is an accessibility issue, which we discussed. But more specifically, no way out. No way out is more the fact that the only exit on the ride that you take is 174-step spiral. For anybody with any mobility issues, visual impairments, any other things like that, it won't work. So basically, when the mail rail system was converted into an attraction, it was very, very clearly stated that there were quite large numbers of people who were not to be using it. And so there were very clear lists of people who it would be unsuitable, or it was viewed as being unsuitable to use. However, that's not good, and that's where the project came from. The project came out of the fact that just because these physical limitations existed, that's no good reason to say that this ride, this experience, shouldn't be accessible in some way. There is a version of the ride which exists currently in the entrance hall, but it really is just video. It isn't very interesting. So, having spent several years, or a couple of years, worrying that this was a problem, knowing this was a problem, that having this access problem was an issue, they looked, and the Post Office Museum looked, the Royal Mail, the Mail Museum looked at using virtual reality as a solution, which seemed a reasonable idea, because it might offer ways of experiencing the ride, but actually not necessarily being in the physical space with all of the issues of access and exit. And one of the things which came out of that, and this comes back to ScanLab, one of the things which happened when they closed the ride down was ScanLab was employed to three-dimensionally laser scan the whole of the system. They have a data file, they have many data files, which are on the day of closure of the whole system, in full color, in full 3D, the whole system. So they have the data set. The whole of the environment is available for modeling. They do have to model everything, up to and including weird elements where you can see the Christmas tree, which is stuffed and covered in a lot of platform. It is extraordinary. Theoretically, therefore, a project using the Royal Mail Museum, using ScanLab data, using connections to the disability community in London, and using the tech which is available, VR goggles, really, the standard methodologies. That would look like a well-planned solution. However, what we did, what we were interested in, was actually testing whether that was actually true. So the research project was working with 3 groups of people with different forms of impairment, physical, cognitive, different ages, different genders, all that sort, in order to be able to understand whether what seems and what is being offered by many museums now, VR goggles, getting everywhere, whether it was actually a good solution. There are questions. There are 2 parts. I will start with the first one. Number 1, virtual reality and human capacities, both physical and cognitive. There are many issues with the way in which VR technology currently works. Yes, weird colours again. Okay, physical ergonomics. We tested using Google Cardboard systems, full VR immersion systems like that, and another system which we'll get to later on. The physical ergonomics, cables everywhere, heavy headsets. These things are not great. We tested with, this is a person, she has multiple sclerosis. We tested with multiple groups. the issues of being able to, we had at least 2 people holding cables during this, so she's within an immersive area. So she can see herself within, if memory serves, a space in Venice, which Scandinavia happen to have in their data sets. Using this kind of system, we had serious issues with the weight of the system, putting it on, taking it off, the fact that we were having to use at least 2, maybe 3 members of staff to be able to actually control the system properly. It was not good. And that's even just the basics. I mean, we were working with quadriplegic users in wheelchairs without use of arms and with breathing systems to support their abilities to breathe and exist. So this sort of stuff was just unhelpful. It just got in the way of the technology that they were using. So we had physical ergonomic issues, that the accessibility of these systems did not work. But also we had cognitive ergonomic issues. We had serious problems in testing with the way in which the systems were both controlled and the way in which the experiences were designed. Control systems, this is people who were, we had a large visual impairment test group, people with differing levels of visual impairment. Cardboard, which is what they were testing there, cardboard assumes that you can actually control the system by looking at a dot and then selecting systems. So we had UI problems from the offset in terms of being able to control access to the virtual reality experiences. We also then, and this sort of crosses over between the two, we had issues with the way in which the experiences were designed. For this group of people, the visually impaired group, we had, even though they weren't taking in the visual experience, they were taking in the auditory experience, they were taking in the sound and so the rest of it. And the problem they had was it was a bit crap. Because for the most part, people design for visual experiences, because people are obsessed with visual experiences. But this is a massive miscomprehension of the sensory load of human beings. Human beings are auditory. We are based in our audio system. If you screw up the audio, you screw up the experience. This is what, there was some work done by the BBC at the Commonwealth Games, I don't know many years ago that is, where they tested a multitude of VR systems and they degraded the video. And that wasn't so much an issue. But when they degraded the audio, things broke quickly. Human beings very good at correcting for visual ambiguity, visual problems. Very bad at correcting for audio, because we depend on audio. Our sensory systems structure off our audio experiences. So the crappiness of virtual reality is a serious issue. Also, it has to be said, particularly those 2 people there, they were part of a very highly immersive research project at the University of York Research on binaural design systems, which there is a lot of work on. And so therefore the quality was just not as good as you're seeing in some of the binaural research projects. But the other side of this, in experience design terms, and this is a lady called Cassie, who I work with every now and again, was in, and this is an area of cognition or cognitive design which doesn't really get talked about that much, anxiety. The anxiety of being immersed in a virtual world. The anxiety of being in a space where you're uncertain of what's going on. So this whole system of designing for the anticipation of the experience. How do you actually frame anticipation? She found the experiences hard. She found them, and we were talking with some other people in other groups about people who actually do have anxiety issues well beyond generalized concern about anxiety, well into the sort of thing of actual hearing of voices. Operating systems like this, where you are creating visual and audio experiences which may distress people, is an issue in terms of A, how do you actually enable people to anticipate the experience they're going to have? B, how do you actually design the experience to respect the different levels of anxiety that people have? And 3, and this was actually the big one, but 3, how do you actually enable the experience design so people can get the bloody hell out of it? Which with cardboard was less of an issue in terms of you can put it down. Well, that version of cardboard. Those ones, headphones off, it gets messy. Again, you need human beings to be able to support the people in the experience. And once you get into the full VR systems with the cables and the full immersion, it gets very messy in terms of how do people signal their desire to get out? How do you actually design, particularly a museum experience, where you're going to have multiple people in a physical space, in proximity, where this thing goes wrong? What do you do, as with accessible design? What do you do when things go wrong? What is your failure mode? So we kept having issues with this stuff. But that actually wasn't the key issue which came out of the research when we worked with people. We worked with people very heavily to talk about their experiences in museums, to talk about their experience of technologies, and then only after actually several sessions did we actually talk about fundamentals of what are we designing here. We talked a lot before. One of the things which came out of the talks, out of the workshops, out of all the research was this, number 2, the second but, and actually the more important one, which is why it's crucial. What do people want? This is a project designed around research. It was designed around the fact that we've got a data set, we've got technology, let's design something. And it's very easy to get caught out with the idea that you've got this asset, you've got this technology, let's do it. And you don't actually ask people what they want. You design the thing because you have the things. What came out of the research? And came across all the groups who met independently and we talked independently and we didn't sort of try and guide this. Nobody wanted an inaccessible solution. And I know this sounds odd, but the point is, nobody wants an accessible solution. Because if it's not accessible, they're not going to have an experience. Accessibility is merely a barrier. It doesn't, if you're defining your experience design around the accessibility, you're probably in the wrong space. The accessibility has to exist for them to have an experience. They don't want an accessible experience. They want this. People wanted memorable experiences to share now, in the moment of the experience, and later, with their friends, with their family, with the other people they're with. That's actually what they wanted. The accessibility is not the goal. The goal is this: memorable experiences to share now and later. That was the goal. And so then we went through all the technologies. We went through all of these things, looking through virtual reality, looking through all the technologies, all the ways of designing UI. And what we ended up with because of the problems with audio, because of the problems with anxiety, because of the problems with the technologies which we're presented with, was we ended up with narrated journeys in extended spaces. And I'll explain what that means. This is an igloo. It's a three-dimensional projection pod. Projectors up there, project onto the walls. This is actually laid out. But we can project three-dimensional imagery so that you appear to be in the space. We came to this technology, we had to track this technology down, because this clearly became the technology which was the one we needed. Because this gave us a physical space which was accessible to all forms of user, whatever type of wheelchair they had. It had a physical entrance and exit, which meant that people could get in and get out as they chose. And it allowed us to have an audio system. But when we looked at audio systems, when we looked at the way in which we needed to layer atmospheric audio, specific event audio, specific narration audio, we kept coming to the problem that actually it was becoming, and we looked at a number of UIs to look at whether we could get people to control the experiences themselves. But it never really worked, because A, it was giving people game controls which they weren't really used to using, and also some people couldn't use. And B, you end up with this thing of, if this is a group experience, why does one person get to choose? What we ended up with, and there she is, we ended up with human narrators. We found humans were the best solution. We found that the way in which we could actually create a meaningful user interface between a group of users with differing needs, with differing desires to actually experience things, was actually not to use technology. We used human narrators. It allowed us to have the flexibility. It allowed us to actually have a system whereby we could communicate between what the system was needing to deliver. The system didn't deliver us anything we need, but we needed some way of mediating that relationship. And human narrators was there. We did try using a system of avatars. It creeped people out. We did use ghost images, which it was possible to, given the scans, it was possible to actually impose people. Again, anxiety inducing. So, physical immersive space outside of people to allow more people with differing needs and capacities in, human narrator to allow the actual mediation of the experience to be flexible enough for different physical and cognitive needs. So, safe places. The anxiety issues, the issue of being embodied, however much in virtual reality you are going to another place. You never lose your body. Your body is always with you. And we need to find ways of actually balancing the physicality of the human and the emotions of the human, and the anxieties of the human in these spaces as we move people around. Because these people were being moved, we can move them through tunnels, we can fly them through space. We need to make sure it's reasonably done. So again, we tested wheelchair users, the physicality of the space which allowed us to be able to enable people to turn around comfortably. That's one of the avatars, ghostly. It allowed us to test repeatedly different ways of using it. But this is about autonomy. And autonomy is something that's increasingly important to me in accessibility work, in terms of the ability of the person to maintain their own sense of control in a place, in a time. A lot of the time we talk about agency, UX enabling agency, enabling autonomy, the person being able to make their own choices, whether to stay, whether to go. That's really important. Shall we get the shared experiences now? The Igloo allows us to be able to create that. Human narrator allows us to mediate it. So that's people, and that's on the platform at the system. So as such, the system allowed them to travel through the system. So, and again, we didn't replicate the experience which you get if you go on the railway system. We actually had another experience. Because we have more data, they can actually go places people on the train can't. And that was one of the things about having stories to share. If people, if friends and family are going on the mail rail, and people who can't go on the mail rail go on the VR experience, you want them to be able to come together and share experiences which differ. You don't want to relate simply an experience which is a version of the thing which already exists. We want to create something, as I say, it's not the accessibility, it's the memorability of the stories to tell. Stories to share. That's what was important. We tested a number of narratives, a number of ways of approaching it. And we listened to the way that people talked about the stories in order to understand how people would wish to share the experience to their friends and families. So the VR extends where we can be. And it extends it in ways that mean we can tell new stories to each other. So, the accessible VR that we ended up with was about the augmentation and war of experiences. It wasn't the technology. What was it? It's about stories people want to tell each other, share with each other. And that's it.